I have a question for you. During which year since the invasion in 2001 would you have expected the US to have dropped the most number of bombs on Afghanistan in a given year? Perhaps you might think it was during the Bush years, under the Obama administration. Well, what if I told you that last year the US dropped an annual record of 7,423 bombs on Afghanistan, which killed more than 70 children, at a time when public support for the war in Afghanistan was at an all-time low. According to a poll conducted 7 years ago, almost 70% of Americans supported US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And according to another poll conducted only a few months ago by a conservative activist group, nearly 3/4 of veterans and almost 70% of troops' family members support a full withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. So why is that war still going on? What if I told you the reason the war is still going on is the same reason why America has terrible public schooling, mass incarceration, prescription drug abuse epidemics, and a whole host of issues that don't affect other developed countries in the same way?
There's no earthly way of knowing
He's singing.
which direction we are going.
The US is still in Afghanistan because an entire industry relies on the US meddling in foreign affairs. And because the politicians rely on this industry to help fund their campaigns and further their careers, they are more than happy to maintain the status quo. The issue is really with the interference of special interests in American politics. Giving preferential treatment to these special interests comes with consequences. These issues are on full display with the recent debate on police brutality. For too long, politicians have ignored the root cause of social issues and actively made them worse by pandering to lobbies, unions, and large corporations. They pawned off resulting issues like homelessness and drug abuse onto the police to sort out, rather than standing up to the lobbies and pushing for much-needed educational reform. So how did we get here? The answer is relatively simple and the solution a bit more complex. There is too much money in politics. I know what you're thinking. Yeah, so what? And the Pope's Catholic. Next you're going to start lecturing me about how you just woke up to systemic oppression like you and all the other aegis on my Instagram feed. To dig deeper into how we really got here, we do have to go back in time a little bit. And I'm only doing that to make it clear this is not how things always were, and it's not how they always have to be. So a long time ago, before Pizzagate and Gamergate and Gategate, there was this little scandal that you might have heard of called Watergate. Well, basically what happened was that the President of the United States at the time, Richard Nixon, tried to cover up the fact that those involved with his re-election campaign had attempted to break into the campaign headquarters of his political opponent in the Watergate Hotel in DC, which is where the scandal gets its name from. The investigation eventually led to Nixon's resignation, but it also uncovered a trail of money that exposed millions in then illegal secret contributions from major American companies. And I say then illegal because it's no longer illegal for companies to donate to political campaigns, but that's an issue I'll come back to in a bit. So after Watergate, Congress established the Federal Election Commission and made laws to limit how much money people could donate to political campaigns. The new laws were designed to put limits on how much money people could donate directly to candidates, which they called hard money, and also on the amount of money that they could donate to political parties and committees like the DNC and RNC, which they called soft money. From the late 1970s until the mid-1990s, the new Federal Election Commission gradually loosened restrictions on the soft money that corporations, unions, and individuals could contribute to political parties for activities intended to influence elections. And as you would expect, the amount of soft money contributed to the two major parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, subsequently soared. This was until the early 2000s when Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Russ Feingold had enough, and through a long and tiresome process, finally managed to shut down the use of soft money through the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. This act also happened to include the Stand By Your Ad provision, which gave us this gem.
I'm Paris Hilton, and I approve this message.
Alright, so, things are good. We got money out of politics, McCain and Feingold can pat themselves on the back. Yeah, not quite. So, the 2004 Bush versus Kerry election was the first presidential election to be affected by the new reforms, and as you would expect, they already found a pretty clever way around it. Many of the soft money funded activities previously undertaken by political parties were taken over by what they called 527 organizations, which were not regulated by the FEC or under the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. But we did get a lot of hope in 2008 when the Obama campaign pioneered a new grassroots movement to source financing by mobilizing activists, donations, and voters through the internet. Using the internet and these new tactics, Obama set fundraising records in just over a month by gaining support from a record-breaking number of individual small donors. It seemed like the internet age had ushered in a new era of campaign financing that enabled politicians to grow their brand in the marketplace of ideas and fund their campaigns through millions of small individual contributions. Sounds super democratic. But part of the problem was that it was too successful because now it became really expensive to run for president. But we didn't really know that yet, and things were pretty fine until 2010, when the courts waged what I can only describe as lawfare against the democratic process through their decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, when they ruled that corporations and other outside groups could spend unlimited funds on elections. How did they come to that decision? Well, through everyone's second favorite amendment, second only to the Second Amendment, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. In the court's opinion, corporate spending on elections was basically free speech and was therefore protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court held that corporations merit the same protection as individuals and that donations to political campaigns are the same as speech. But there's a fundamental difference between money and speech. Money is the currency of civil society, whereas anyone who's visited a comment section will know that speech is the currency of barbarism. Also, individuals are entirely different to corporations. A corporation is a device through which someone acquires profit for their boss's 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 boss, whereas an individual is one who believes he has the option to just bunk off work one day, but doesn't actually in reality.
You're all individuals! Yes, we're all individuals! You're all different! Yes, we are all different! I'm not.
But why, might you ask, would
The Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States
decide to drown out the political speech of the American people by handing a megaphone to large corporations? Well, I'll sum it up really quickly. The court basically decided to extend the First Amendment protection on free speech to corporate political campaign contributions because of the age-old fear of the overreaching government. They were afraid that ruling in favor of the government in Citizens United would give the government power to ban political speech, rather than ruling on the issue of the case, which was regulating the money used to make that speech. I mean, forget the fact that the foundation of the country is built on a distrust of both government and corporations. I don't know if you remember this little tea party which was held at the expense of the British East India Company in 1773. Okay, I'll stop harping on this point in a second, but I also like to point out that the tradition of free speech in the US predates court judgments regarding the development of free speech. Throughout history, the American people have proven that they don't need 9 Harvard and Yale educated men and women in robes to subvert the democratic process in the name of protecting free expression. Despite the actions of government, it's the actions of individuals through speech and protest that allow democracy to function appropriately. But throughout history, we've seen that again and again, people in power have treated speech that advocates lawful change through democratic process as an incitement to lawless action. What I just said should sound pretty familiar to a lot of you out there now. The fundamental issue of governance that democracy is designed to address is that immense power and influence in the hands of the few will always be used at the expense of the many, whether those minority interests represent the monarchy, politicians, judges, corporations, universities, unions, lobbyists, or any kind of other institution. If you're under 30, I'm willing to take a small wager that it could be the first time that you've heard of the Citizens United decision. And you might be asking, wait, isn't this an election year? Surely this should be something that we're talking about. I mean, the decision is pretty recent, so shouldn't we be debating its effects? Why is it never on the news? Well, I'll tell you, if you Google who owns the news channels and who's donating to political campaigns, you'll find your answer right there. Okay, so what are the politicians going to do about it? Have you ever heard the expression, don't bite the hand that feeds? Corporate campaign contributions literally put dinner on the table and roofs over the heads of career politicians. And the Supreme Court reversed a century of legislation designed to control corporate influence in politics with Citizens United. So is there really much the politicians can do even if they wanted? In my opinion, the legacy of the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United is that it has exacerbated divisions within the country, but it was only the cherry on top of a payoff pie. One study found that state legislators became more conservative after the Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling, and also found an apparent small increase in the ideological extremism of representatives. The latter effect was found to be even stronger for Democrats, who became more liberal than Republicans became conservative. Look, I know I don't need to harp on much longer to explain to you that America is divided. Well, unless you've been living in a box for the last 5 years, in which case it's probably a good time to just get back in the box and wait until all this is over. The fact of the matter is, while Citizens United might have given corporations the right to free speech, they don't actually want to exercise their right to political speech because it hurts their bottom line. But they will pay money to support candidates that promise to pass legislation that they think will help their bottom line. This is only exacerbating the pro-business and anti-capitalist tilt of both Democratic and Republican career politicians. Okay, so I've just unloaded a lot on you. What can you do to solve the problem? What is it that everybody's saying now on Twitter and Instagram?
That's why we have to vote.
Yeah, I hate to burst your bubble, but that isn't going to solve the problem in its entirety when both major political parties are so deeply corrupted. I'll let investigative journalist Greg Palast explain.
Between 2014 and 2016, the number of voters purged for moving their residence had soared to 16,696,470. 1 in 12 registered Americans. Mail-in ballots are a nightmare. 22% are thrown out. Move to 80% mail-in voting, and 25 million people would lose their votes.
No matter who you vote for in November, it's more likely than not that you're going to get 4 more years of the same corrupt, crony capitalist shit. Unless you put pressure on your representatives and senators to accomplish the same kind of bipartisan reform that McCain and Feingold were able to accomplish in 2002. There is simply no reason why we need corporations, PACs, and super PACs to fund political campaigns when we have the internet and an increasingly sophisticated crowdfunding economy. And I know you're sick of hearing this, that one issue is just part of a bigger issue, but the Citizens United decision and the issue of campaign financing is just one part of a much broader issue. According to the preamble of the US Constitution, the United States was established to form a more perfect union. But let's be honest here, perfection's both an imaginary state and a moving target. The truth is that the perfection of the American Union in its current form lies somewhere between mediocrity and excellence, depending on which country you're comparing it to. The reason that America is losing its way is not because of late-stage capitalism or whatever the pseudo-intellectual buzzword of the day is. I'll explain the problem with a very simple example. If you take a mason jar and you fill it up with jelly beans and you ask your friend how many beans are in the jar, chances are their guess is going to be way off. If you ask a quantity surveyor, their guess might be better. But if you ask 100 people and then take the average of their guesses, you would be astounded as to how close the average estimate is to the truth. This phenomenon is called the wisdom of the crowd. Funny that, because the crowd gets a bit of a bad rap with its tendency toward groupthink and mob mentality, but it's the foundation of democracy and free market systems. The collective knowledge of a group of individuals almost always trumps the individual knowledge of a single person, no matter how smart that person is. I fact-checked most of the information for this script using Wikipedia, which is the ultimate testament to what humans are capable of accomplishing as a collective. I mean, can you imagine one person writing all of Wikipedia? It's impossible. The beauty of democratic and free market institutions and systems is that they're designed to represent the diffuse interests of the collective. These systems are also much less susceptible to corruption than alternative political and economic systems that place a lot of power and decision-making ability in the hands of a few individuals, regardless of the benevolent or malevolent intention of those individuals. But democracy and capitalism are not immune to corruption, and when it becomes obvious to us that the issue exists, it becomes our responsibility to do something about it. How is it that the CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, is basically unaffected by the pandemic, while millions of Americans are unemployed? How can he turn to his investors and say, "Don't worry about JP Morgan, the Fed has our back"? Who has the back of the American people? It's supposed to be Congress, but the CARES Act makes it pretty obvious where their allegiance lies. I will argue that because the issue is systemic, it requires systemic reform to realign the incentives of public servants and politicians in order to force them to represent the people and not special interests. We need systemic reform to rebalance the distribution of power back in the hands of the majority, because that's how it's supposed to be in a democratic free market society. Okay, so where can we start? I think we need to start with some serious electoral reforms to address how people vote, to ensure that everybody who has the right to vote can exercise that right, to address how long the individuals they elect are allowed to hold office, and to regulate where lawmakers get their information from once they're in office. In my opinion, addressing voter disenfranchisement is the first step towards solving this issue. We need to put pressure on the corrupted Democratic and Republican elite to end rampant voter suppression, highlighted by reporters like Greg Palast. We could make radical change to solve the issue of campaign financing by simply making voting mandatory, because corporations would no longer have an incentive to get certain groups out to vote over others. If you disagree with that solution because you believe that your right to vote is an important act of civil disobedience, then I say power to you. By all means, feel free to register at the polling station and choose not to vote, or soil your vote as an act of protest. And of course, making voting mandatory would require making Election Day a federal holiday. But with statewide lockdowns, I think the ship has sailed on arguing that a single day of lost labour is going to destroy the national economy. Electoral reform is just one of the many policy solutions that is required to regulate the conflicts of interest and perverse incentives of the current economic and political systems. Both the introduction of term limits and a ban on political lobbying would also go far to stop minority special interest groups from hijacking the democratic process for their own benefit at the expense of the wider public, although those are issues I will cover in further detail in a later video. I just want to leave with the final note to some of the younger people who might be watching this video. You've probably started to take for granted the fact that the Supreme Court has had a pretty high profile for most of your life, but the truth is that if the justices are doing their job, we really shouldn't know who they are. Starting in the mid-1900s, the court has become increasingly politicized, and while many of the decisions that they made are those that you probably would have agreed with, like the desegregation of schools in Brown versus Board of Education, and perhaps protecting the woman's right to choose in Roe versus Wade, the truth is that the politicization of the court means that it can also go in the opposite direction. Former Senator Al Franken once joked that when politicians talk about judicial activism, their definition of an activist judge is one who votes differently than they would like. And President Abraham Lincoln warned that if government policy became irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the people would have ceased to be their own rulers. I'll leave you by saying that some matters are best left to legislation and for the people to decide. The people have the power to amend the Constitution, to protect the social contract, and to reflect their changing values as a society. People are much happier with the decisions that they make as a collective, rather than those passed down from a bunch of Ivy League educated lawyers in robes. Even if they disagree with the majority, they at least know that the majority of Americans feel that way, and they can come to peace with that.
You all got to work it out for yourself. Yes, we've got to work it out